Hello and welcome to today's Lunch and Learn in advance of Purim on the US.tv. We're really grateful that you can join us and that we can spend some time learning together in advance of Purim. Now today I'd like to look at what I think is one of the playmaker chapters of the Megillah, the Scroll of Esther, which of course is our central text of the book of Purim, the book of Esther which we read in Shul or wherever we have a Megillah scroll. And chapter 6, even though it's short, has some fantastic material for really analyzing the essence of the Megillah. And that's what we're going to try and do today. Now, the chapter opens with a famous statement, which for those of you who are in the US in your Pocket WhatsApp group, you would have heard a little bit about this in one of our podcasts last week. If you're not in that WhatsApp group, please do go to our social media and join that group if you'd like to. But we talked about the famous night, as the Megillah puts it, Balayla hahu nadada shenat hamelech. On that night, the king's sleep was somehow disturbed. The king, of course, is Achashverosh. But what was going on that night that disturbed his sleep? What's the background to this particular part of the story? In particular, it's a fascinating study in the rise and fall of Haman. Up until this point, if I was to chart Haman on a graph, I would say that he is going up and up and up. If he was a Formula One driver, he was today with Mercedes and he was getting into 195 in sixth gear very easily. However, in chapter 7, suddenly he loses power, literally and figuratively. And things suddenly start to go down. Let's try and set the scene, put ourselves in the shoes of the characters. Haman has succeeded in chapter 5 in getting a decree against Mordechai. Mordechai would not bow down or prostrate himself to Haman, even though the king had commanded the courtiers to this. And Haman, even though he was at the height of his powers, even though he seemed to be the number 2 in the kingdom, says something quite remarkable. He says, "V'chol zeh einenu shoveh li." All of this means nothing to me. The whole time, every time when I see Mordechai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Now this is quite remarkable insight into Haman. Such was his hatred that even being in a position of such power, he could not live with it because of his hatred for Mordechai. So his family, his friends at home make a helpful suggestion. They say, hold on a second, why don't you make a gallows for Mordechai? Hang it 50 cubits high. 50 cubits high is enormous. A cubit is approximately the distance from the tip of the fingers to the elbow. This is very, very high. Okay? And you can hang Mordechai on this. And tomorrow, when you go to the party with Esther and Achashverosh, which in chapter 6 Haman has been invited to, feels very good about, when you go to that party, just say to the king that you're going to hang Mordechai. This restores Haman's flagging spirits. Vayitav hadavar lifnei Haman. He was delighted. Vayas ha'etz. And look at that alacrity. He gets on and builds these enormous gallows. He can't even wait till the next day for it to happen. So as we end chapter 5 and go into chapter 6, the outlook looks very, very bleak for us. Mordechai seems to be in trouble. Haman seems to be jubilant at the peak of his powers. Haman has been invited by Esther to this party with Achashverosh. He feels very, very privileged. And even though there is this fly in the ointment of this Jew Mordechai, as he is contemptuously referred to, a solution is at hand. With this introduction, let's consider again the beginning of chapter 7 and that famous night. When reading the Megillah, it's even read with a special tune, perhaps in order to wake us up, pun intended, to what's going on over here, that something remarkable is about to happen. Now, whenever we hear the phrase Balayla hahu, that night, if we are sensitive to the rest of the Tanakh, the rest of the Hebrew Bible, which of course we should be when studying it, we should always look for comparisons and usage of the same words in different places. Ba laila hahu, on that night. What is that night? Perhaps, say, the rabbis of the Midrash, the rabbis of the Talmudic and post-Talmudic era who would, as Rabbi Dr. Irving Jacobs, Zichrono Livracha, taught us, would roll up their sleeves and use the verses to teach us religious messages and what they thought about Judaism. The rabbis of the Midrash immediately linked Laila Hahu, that night, to the most famous Laila in Jewish history. That, of course, is the Laila of the Leil HaSeder, of the night on which we left Egypt. There are references to this in the Torah, in Parashat Bo, where the material about the exodus from Egypt is introduced, but also in the songs of the Seder. Vahi bachatzi halayla, halayla hazeh, all of these references. So, the rabbis of the Midrash say that when this phrase is used by Laila hazeh, it may well be referring to something which happened on the night of Pesach, and that's redemption night. That is the night when things will happen to the Jewish people. Another good example of this, historically speaking, is the famous passage in the Haggadah about the rabbis gathering together in Bnei Brak. Now, why on earth were they not at home, particularly in the absence of the temple? Or if there was a temple, why weren't they at the temple? Why were they gathering together in Bnei Brak? And you can see, for example, the late Rabbi Sax's, Zichrono Livracha's essay in his Haggadah about this particular setting. One of the reasons suggested is that whatever they were discussing, it had to be discussed on a night of redemption. This is one of the special qualities of the Seder night. So on that night, which is an auspicious night for the Jewish people, Nadada Shenat HaMelech, the king's sleep was disturbed. Now Rashi, who is of course our primary commentator on the Tanakh, on the Hebrew Bible, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, lived in medieval France and Germany, he notes, first of all, that this disruption of the king's sleep, was a miracle. Now, let's just step back and think what this means. The Midrash gives one, I think, humorous explanation for this, which is the king had had so much to drink at the first party that Esther had invited Achashverosh and Haman to, that it's a miracle that he couldn't sleep soundly the whole night. But we also know, as we've discussed in our podcasts, that the Megillah is a book that is written with divine inspiration. It's a book of prophecy. It's a book of many miracles. And some of these miracles come to fruition and can be observed in our chapter. So Rashi says that because of perhaps the auspicious nature of this night, there was a nace. It was a miracle that Achashverosh's sleep was disturbed. And of course, as we'll see, this comes to be very much to the benefit of Mordechai. The second explanation Rashi brings is also a fascinating one. And to put it in a modern context, as one of my favorite Tanakh teachers, Rabbi Yitzchak Et Shalom, notes, there is a psychological commentary going on to the story of the Megillah here. Rashi notes that Achashverosh was awake because he was worried. He was concerned. Why? He was beginning to reflect on why Esther had invited just him and Haman to a party, and had said, I'm not going to tell you what I want till the first party. And then the first party said, I'm not going to tell you what I want till the second party. What was going on? What game is being played over here? And Ahasuerus was worried that maybe perhaps Haman and Esther were in cahoots against him. Maybe there was some other danger that was taking place, given the ruthless nature of the Persian court at the time. So Ahasuerus is concerned. He can't sleep. There's something which he can't get to the bottom of, even though he is the king, the despotic emperor of this mighty empire. And his sleep is disturbed because of that. And as we will see, something miraculous is about to happen. The next verse, the continuation of the first verse says, Vayomer, and the king said, Lahaviet Sefer HaZichronot Divrei Hayamim, to bring the book of remembrances, the book of Chronicles. And they were read before the king. In the passive sense, the verb was there, which, as we would explain, is very significant. Now, you might think if the king couldn't sleep, he might go get a drink, he might try and fall asleep in some way, and perhaps he feels that by hearing these Sefer Zichronot and Divrei Hayamim read to him, that's going to put him to sleep. However, we have to work out what these books are and whether that assumption is correct. The phrase Divrei Hayamim in the Megillah has been used earlier on. We looked at this a couple of weeks ago in our first Purim Shiur. It's the phrase which refers to the aftermath of the plot of Bigtan and Teresh against Achashverosh at the end of chapter 2. When Mordechai revealed the information which he had gathered about the plot against Achashverosh, and this was used by Achashverosh to prevent the attack being planned against him by Bigtan and Teresh, two of his courtiers. Now, the Megillah records at that point that Mordechai's good deed was recorded in Divrei Hayamim, in the National Chronicles. Here, however, the king has read before him Sefer HaZichronot, the book of remembrances, Divrei Hayamim, the National Chronicles. There's an extra reference here, which we'll have to understand. And what does this reference tell us? Verse 2. And we're going to see on the screen in just a moment. The verse is coming up, so you can follow along. You can see verse 2 over here. This is the Machon Mamre translation. It's somewhat archaic, but it's a very rich and beautiful translation, all the way back from the early 20th century. So what is in these books? Verse 2. And it was found written there. Everything in the passive to show that this is not by chance. That Mordechai had told of Bigtan and Teresh, these two courtiers of the king, who had tried to lay hand on the king Achashverosh, to threaten him. Verse 3, and the king said, what gratitude has been shown to Mordechai, what goodness has been done to him. And the king's attendants said to him, Lo na'asa imo davar. Nothing, not a thing has been done for him. Now, what's going on here? First of all, we have a clue now to what's going on with the reference of Sefer HaZichronot Divrei Hayamim. One of the great 19th century biblical commentators was Rabbi Meir Leibush, who most famously was the chief rabbi of Bucharest, one of many positions he held. One of the reasons he had many positions was that with his tremendous scholarship, in which he refuted biblical critics and others who wished to threaten traditional and foundational ideas in Judaism, particularly through his voluminous commentary on the Tanakh, he made many enemies. If people couldn't better him in scholarship or in piety, then they would find underhand methods. And sadly, he had to move around often because of the enemies he made through his principled stand and because of the defense he made of the Jewish people. And in analyzing this phrase, he says something fascinating. He says that the Sefer HaZichronot were the personal records which the king kept. It was like his personal diary. Divrei Hayamim, the National Chronicles, were a national record. And, says the Malbim, which is the acronym for Rabbi Meir Leibush, he says that the Divrei Hayamim, the National Chronicles, were under the charge of none other than Haman. And as Haman's stock rose and his hatred for Mordechai grew, he erased Mordechai's name from the Divrei Hayamim. He did not want Mordechai to be repaid for the good he had done to the king. But Haman could not get his hand on the king's personal diaries. So therefore, when the Sefer HaZichronot were read, this piqued the king's interest. Mordechai, I remember him. Why is it that nothing has been done to honor him? And this is another part of the miracle following Rashi's reading. Because the king might have thought he'd become drowsy through reading all these historical reminiscences or things which he might have known already. But instead, something clicked in his mind. Mordechai, maybe because I haven't done something good to him. Maybe I still need to do something good to him. Suddenly, he's awake. He's alert. He recognizes that he's got an obligation to fulfill. And the fact that this would happen at this particular time, again, according to Rashi, is miraculous. Because the Megillah then throws up an incredible irony. After the king asks at the end of verse 3, in verse 3, what has been done to Mordechai, and the courtiers answer nothing, you might expect there to be a further discussion of this. But there seems not to be instead, in verse 4, a non sequitur almost. And the king said, who's in the courtyard? Now, suddenly, then let's put ourselves in the shoes of the characters. There must have been some noise. At some stage in the night. Maybe it's later on in the night getting towards morning, but it's the night time. You wouldn't expect anybody to be in the royal courtyard at that time, certainly unexpected or unannounced. The king is immediately on alert. Mi vechatzer, who is in the courtyard? They are interrupted from their deliberations. For Haman ba, and Haman had come. Lachatzar beit hamelech hachitzona, to the king's outer courtyard. Leimor lamelech, to say to the king, litzlot mord et Mordechai, to hang Mordechai al ha'etz asher hichin lo, on the gallows which Haman had prepared for Mordechai. You couldn't time this any better. Not only is the king reading about Mordechai's goodness, that Mordechai was the loyal one, but had not been rewarded for his loyalty. And not only is the king reading this from his own personal notes, as the Malbim would say to us, rather than the national notes, but Haman has also come at a time which surprises the king. And the king, as Rashi taught us, and we'll remember, is wondering, what's Haman really up to here? Why is Haman in the palace at the wrong time of night? What's he doing wandering around? Why has he been here? Why is he approaching me now? This, of course, begs many questions. In another sense of irony, by the way, some of the Midrashim note that the passive verbs used to explain the reading that took place of this information before Achashverosh was to show that it was Haman's own sons who were doing the reading. They didn't want to, but they were forced to. This only adds to the sense of power and irony about what is about to happen. Stunned by this, the king is not sure how to react. And the narrator of the Megillah has just told us that Haman is in the courtyard. And the king's own courtiers respond to the king's question, Mi bechatzer, who is in the courtyard. The king's courtiers said to him, Hinei Haman omei bechatzer. Behold, to our surprise, Haman is standing in the courtyard. And without Haman having asked anything, but with a presumption that he wanted to come in, Vayomer HaMelech Yavo. And the king said, he will come. Now this can be read somewhat ominously, especially if we follow the thread which we're developing here. And the next verse 6, has the note on it, the long note, the Zarka, which adds a sense of occasion and, I think, an ominous note to the proceedings. It goes like this. You're wondering what's going to happen. And the text continues. And the king said to him, didn't say, how are you? What are you doing here? The king immediately fires a question at Haman. Now, by the way, this could be an example of the king perhaps being cleverer and more perceptive than he is at other times during the story of the Megillah. Because rather than relying on others to make decisions, the king here is decisive. He doesn't allow Haman to settle. He's perhaps testing out Haman, given the worries that he has as expressed by Rashi. So Vayomer lo Hamelech, the king says to Haman, Ma la'asot, what is there to do, ba'ish, with a person, who the king wants to honor? Vayomer Haman belibo, and Haman said in his heart. This phrase, by the way, is another of the proofs used by the Talmud to show that this is a prophetic work, because otherwise, how would the narrator of the Megillah know what Haman said in his heart, unless God had given prophetic insight to this? Vayomer Haman belibo, and Haman said in his heart, who can there be that the king will want to bestow greatness upon more than me? Haman here has committed a critical error. Rather than considering the king's question, or even asking more to find out what the king really wants to know, which would also give Haman an insight into the king's state of mind, Haman has made an assumption that this has to be about him. And because Haman is so full of his own ego and importance, we can suggest, because Haman's not really thinking about the other people here, but is so full of himself, Haman makes this quantum leap into thinking the king must be talking about him, and comes out with something utterly bizarre. Verse 7, Vayomer Haman el HaMelech, and Haman said to the king, Ish asher HaMelech chafetz bikaro, a person whom the king wishes to honor, ... We'll see what this is in a second as the screen scrolls up. Pleased to see the continuation of the verse. Great, thank you. Big thanks to our tech team, by the way, for running everything today. So verse 8 continues what the Haman's response. Yaviu levush malchut. So they will bring the royal garb, which the king himself wears, and the horse which the king himself rides upon, and the royal crown which is worn by the royal horse. Now, this is so bizarre, one hardly knows what to do with it. Haman is saying that if the king wants to honor someone, he should dress him like the king and put him on the king's horse. And then verse 9, and the garb and the horse should be administered by one of the king's courtiers. Who will dress the honoree in the king's clothing, and they will lead him through the streets on the horse, through the streets of the city, and they will call before him, thus is done to the person the king wants to honor. Now, if Ahasuerus was worried beforehand, he must be even more worried here. Because Haman, through his ego, his insensitivity, through his sense of arrogance, is doing his very best to convince the king that something strange is going on here. Because this is almost treasonous. And the response, of course, is remarkable. Verse 10, the king replied to Haman, again, at this stage in the night, whenever it was, when the king couldn't sleep, quickly, now, go, take the horse, the clothes and the horse, as you have spoken, and do this to Mordechai, the Jew, who sits at the royal gate. Exactly the same way of describing Mordechai as was used by Haman when he expressed his hatred and contempt for Mordechai in chapter 5. The irony is incredible. So verse 11, Haman took the clothing and the horse, and he dressed Mordechai. And he led him throughout the city. And he called before him, this is what is done to a person whom the king wishes to honor. So Esther has done her very best to set Haman up for a fool by making him feel so important. Haman has compounded matters by his arrogance, and the king is presumably trying to bring him down a peg. And of course, in the great irony, the king is doing so in a way which shows that Haman has to submit himself to his great enemy, or the one whom he despises. And this is a great reward for Mordechai, whether he wanted it or not. And try and imagine how Haman was feeling at this particular time. I imagine that he was being jeered in the streets by people who thought this was very funny. He was probably feeling absolutely terrible. And in verse 12, we get an insight into what was going on there. Mordechai immediately went back to the gate of the king. He was fasting and praying, perhaps. He wasn't interested in all of these trappings. But Haman went back, very depressed, very deflated to his house. He was mourning, and perhaps he was even had his head covered up in some kind of shame or embarrassment. When he gets home, instead of feeling a sense of warmth and support at home, as maybe he felt at the end of the previous chapter, he gets entirely the opposite. Verse 13. And Haman told all of this to Zeresh's wife, and for all his acolytes, all those who were hangers-on, I suppose, who were with him. everything that had happened. But instead of saying, oh, what a pity, you're going to be okay, his wise advisors, perhaps a sarcastic reference here, said to him, Vizeresh Ishto, and Zeresh's wife, in Mizera, and the notes here again are long to draw our attention to the significance in the whole saga of the Megillah. In Mizera, Mordechai, Asher, Hachilotan Polefanav, if this Mordechai, who you have begun, who is from the seed of the Jews, who you have begun to fall before him, you're not going to prevail against him. Language which is similar, of course, to the language used when Jacob, way back in the book of Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, fights against the angel of Esau. Jacob prevails. Very similar language is used. Because you surely will fall before Mordechai. So whatever they'd said to him in the previous chapter, when they encouraged him to hang Mordechai, they were evidently not telling him the truth then. But here, their true opinion comes out. It's even more crushing for Haman. And then verse 14, closing with the chapter, Odam Medabarim, why they are still talking to him. This is the day after the night before. And the king's courtiers came. They hurried to bring Haman to the party which Esther had arranged. Now, the setup here is fantastic because, of course, Achashverosh is in a foul mood, one would imagine, with Haman. His interest is piqued by what Esther wants from this party. He might still be wondering if Esther is in cahoots with Haman, and somehow he's going to find out now, and what happened during the night was just an aberration. There are all kinds of things occupying Haman's mind, which give Esther the opportunity, in chapter 7, to be able to strike at the king and make sure that her request is one which shocks him and will definitely be accepted. So when we analyze chapter 6 in this way, we see that it perhaps acts as a bridge between the first part of the Megillah and the second part. And we see how Haman is built up through his own ego, skillfully played by Esther and by Achashverosh, and how the miraculous nature of events works out, showing God's hand behind the scenes, so to speak, helping Mordechai in particular, but all of the people, despite all of the dangers that they were facing. And Haman's sense of arrogance, sense of ego, lack of awareness, only served to fuel the king's suspicion of him and literally take him off his high horse, where Mordechai is placed instead. So I hope that through reading this chapter in the way that we have, you can gain not only some new insights into the Megillah and to some of the issues that lie behind it, but see why these verses are so important in scoping out the contours of the Megillah and understanding how Haman's downward spiral was about to get even worse. So once again, thank you for joining this afternoon. If you have a chance and you wish to join, do go to our social media and join our WhatsApp US in the Pocket, your Pocket group, which has regular inspirational thoughts and Divrei Torah. And I wish you all a very happy and safe Purim. And just as we say in the Megillah and in the Havdalah every week, from quoting from the Megillah, La Yehudim Hayital Ora V'Simcha V'Sason Vikar, the Jews had light and rejoicing and happiness, and this was something very precious to them. May we be blessed with that rejoicing and that happiness, and despite our circumstances, a most wonderful Purim for us and for Jews all over the world. All the best.